and welcome to part 2 of chapter 2, The Essence of Economics. Before I begin, once again, students are encouraged to take notes during the chapter presentation, either through the use of Cornell Notes or the prepackaged custom study guides that are available for each chapter and can be found through the course website. Now let's begin. In part 2 of this chapter, we're fundamentally going to do two things. The first is look at measurements in economic and business-specific decision-making, and then wrap up chapter 2 in general by looking at general decision goals and how they fit into the cost-benefit analysis. As we begin here in part 2, we're going to take a deeper look at economic and business measurements by building upon the marginal concepts that we were introduced to in the first part of the chapter. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is take a look at how a business is fundamentally measured. When you start a business to either produce a product or provide a service, the first thing that you're going to have to do is incur some costs. In other words, the money that's paid for materials, labor, utilities, tools, supplies, so that you can either manufacture or produce your product or provide the service. If you're not familiar with the word incur as it's used here, it's a verb. It means to bring upon oneself or to take on. To contract, acquire, used in another sentence, she incurred a heavy penalty for her actions. Now, costs are looked at in a number of different ways when we measure businesses, but for our purposes here in this chapter, we're just going to categorize costs in two ways. First is the cost of production, meaning the cost that you incur to either build or your product or provide the service. In other words, those materials, utilities, labor, tools, and the like. The other type of costs that we're going to look at here are administrative costs. To, again, produce your product or provide your service that are not directly related to the actual construction of the product or the service. As an example, if you hire somebody to sell your product or service, the costs associated with that fall under administrative costs, not the cost of actually producing it. The same would hold true for anything that you pay out for advertising your product or service, or, for example, if you hire an accountant to keep your books, or a lawyer to set up fundamental contracts for you. Those are costs associated with the business that are not directly related to the actual production of the product or service. The next fundamental observation that we use to measure a business is revenue. Now, many times people who have limited economic or business background confuse revenue with profit. Revenue is simply the money that's collected when a customer buys your good or service. What profit is revenue minus your costs, or how much over and above you make from your initial investment in your business. Sometimes a visual helps people to better understand this. So here we have an example using a fictitious company called the Global Widget Company. Let's say its revenue is $20. Its cost to produce the product, the widgets, is $8. So it has a profit of $12. Now, every business or firm wants to maximize its profits. In other words, make as much money as possible for its owners and investors. And there are two types of profits that businesses keep an eye on. The first is accounting profit. What accounting profit is the actual, real, hard dollar profits. The total revenue for a business minus its explicit costs. In other words, the $12 in the prior example that we just looked at. Then there is a second type of profit. It's called economic profit. And what economic profit is taking the accounting profit and adding to it exceeding the opportunity costs of pursuing an alternative investment. And this is the most important type of profit. Economic profit is determined by figuring out return on capital. Return on capital is how much profit is earned on every dollar that's invested. So let's use a simple illustration here as an example. Let's say you decided to start the Global Widget Company, and to build your widgets, initially it cost you $8 up front to get the business started. And the business was able to produce $20 in revenue. So based upon our illustration prior, that would leave you with $12 of profit. Now the way to figure out return on capital, in other words, how much profit was earned on that $8 that you put into the business, we do simple math. We divide the profit by the cost, the 8 into 12, and you can see that for every dollar invested, we made 50 cents. And that was our return on capital. Now, let's say you took that $8 and you have other alternatives. Instead of starting the Global Widget Company, you could have put that in a bank or some other type of investment. Let's just for illustration purposes call it global investment. And instead of starting the Global Widget Company, we put the $8 into this investment. And let's say for illustration, this investment was able to generate $14 profit from interest paid on the investment. The return on capital here from this alternative use of the $8 would be 75 cents on every dollar invested. Now in the simple illustration, it's pretty clear to see that the global investment alternative was the better investment by 25 cents economic profit or 25 cents opportunity cost. Now you as an investor had a choice here. You could start your own business and invest the $8 or go to this alternative. By giving up the alternative and staying with the Global Widget Company, you passed up an opportunity cost of 25 cents additional profit on every dollar invested. Now many times in real life, people are not solely driven by the dollars and the profit, that maybe they love making widgets and are very satisfied with the 50 cents on the dollar that the Global Widget Company was returning, and that's perfectly fine. But in measurements of businesses and economic profit, when you're taking your money and investing, this type of exercise is done quite often to try to evaluate what the best alternatives are for people's investment of their money. Now I want to use one other illustration to drive home the point about how important economic profit is and also the measurement of return on capital. And I'm going to go back for illustration purposes to where we were on the prior slide in looking at the Global Widget Company. As you may recall, we had an initial investment of $8 in cost that returned us $12 in profit. And remember that we could have taken our $8 and put it into something else. So let's look at something a little bit different here rather than an investment. The potential of having started a different company. And let's say it's the Global Doohickey Company. But to produce that product, it would have cost us an initial investment of $10. But in this case, our return in profit from that was $14. Now look very closely at this. As you can see, there is an accounting profit match here, of a $4 difference between the two examples. But are these really equal from an economic profit and a return on capital standpoint? And here we'll see the importance of looking at the numbers very closely. The Global Widget Company, as we saw, returned 50 cents on every dollar invested. If you look at the numbers relating to the Doohickey Company, you'll see that the return on capital is less. It was 40 cents on every dollar invested. So in this case, the Global Widget Company, by the pure math, is the better investment by 10 cents or 0.1 opportunity cost. Now I want to make one other point with regard to economic profits, and that's this. Over the long run, economic profits will always be pushed or driven towards zero, and it's done so by competition. Whenever there's profit to be made, and particularly economic profits, but both accounting profits and economic profits, businesses will draw competition, and competitors usually come in and cut prices, which reduces the revenue line in our business measurements. And when the revenue line is reduced, then the accounting profit and the economic profit is reduced. The only way businesses can keep their accounting and economic profit up is by finding some way, if they can, to cut costs. What happens many times is that as economic profit gets reduced and businesses can't cut costs, and competitors are forcing revenue down, many times businesses go out of business because the owner of the company takes their initial $8 investment and goes and finds a better opportunity for their money. As I mentioned a moment ago, when faced with competition, businesses must find a way to lower costs in order to keep their accounting and economic profits up. But in general, whether they face competition or not, businesses and individuals will be successful when they find ways to lower costs. They find ways by maximizing two things. Here's the first. It's productivity. How much value they get out of each hour of a worker's time in their business. This increasing productivity, coupled with efficiency, using scarce resources in such ways as to maximize their benefits, together are the keys to lowering costs. And when you reduce costs, you increase profits, accounting profits and economic profits. Now we're going to take a look at some basic ways to measure these two very important concepts, productivity and efficiency. First of all, businesses know that they are making progress in improving productivity and efficiency when they reach economies of scale. Economies of scale is when average costs fall for each additional unit the business produces and results in increased profit. If we were to draw a picture of this, it would look something simply like this. As output increases, the unit cost of producing each item falls. Here's a great example, I think, to put this in perspective. Most people are familiar with that generally, if you can buy or negotiate buying something in bulk, you could usually get a little bit lower price for whatever it is that you're looking to buy, reduce the cost. Well, if businesses look at their supplies that they need and are able to, with an eye towards efficiency, be able to buy in bulk and negotiate a good deal, they can get their cost of supplies to fall and the supplies used in the production of the product. So that helps them improve their efficiencies and drive towards economies of scale. Now, there are also some marginal analysis terms that we use to analyze productivity and efficiency. And to illustrate this, I'm going to go back to the category of cost measurement that I mentioned earlier in this part of the chapter, called the cost of production. And here's the first marginal analysis concept and term for productivity and efficiency under the category of cost of production. It's what we call marginal product. Marginal product is the change in total product that is produced when the use of a particular resource increases by 1 unit with all other resources remaining constant. Now, I want to draw your attention to two fundamental parts of this definition. The first is to remind you that this is the change. Remember, we've got the word marginal in here, so that means incremental. The incremental change in the total product, amount of product that's produced. That's the first part I want you to keep in mind. The second part is, and this is important, when the use of a particular resource increases by 1 unit. So now let's look at a simple example to illustrate what marginal product actually looks like, and then I have a question for you. Let's say you have a manufacturing company, you're manufacturing some kind of product, and you want to measure the marginal or incremental production change day to day to see if you're improving productivity and efficiency. So let's say you've just established this company and your day one output is 2 of the product that you're manufacturing. On day 2, your output is 4. Now, comparing day 1 to day 2, you see that there is an incremental change in total production of 2. Then if you measure from day 2 to day 3, day 3's total output winds up being 7. You have an incremental change of 3, increasing incremental change. And then for completing our illustration from day 3 to day 4, you have an incremental change of 5. So marginal product as a measurement is this measurement of the incremental change in production from one day to another. So the question I have for you is an increase in what resource could help make this happen? Because remember, as we mentioned a moment ago with the definition of marginal product, the increase, the marginal or incremental increase, was as the result of changing one input resource to help affect the increase in production. So what potential resource could have been changed to make this happen? I'd like for you to keep that question in mind as we move forward here with some other examples. Now, the suggestion of an increase in any number of resources could have been used to explain the incremental increase in production in the example that we just looked at. If you happen to be one of the people that said, well, you could have added more workers, well, that brings us to the next example of marginal analysis term for productivity and efficiency measurements. And that's the marginal product of labor, the change in output from hiring one more worker. So it's very possible in the example that we just looked at that the manufacturing company could have added a worker from day 1 to day 2 or day 2 to day 3 to affect that incremental change. We're going to look at another example here because it's also going to help us set up a couple of other additional important terms that we need to look at. For our next example, we're going to look at a moving company. And the name of this moving company is the Starving Students Moving Company. And yes, there really is a Starving Students Moving Company, but that's a story for another time. Now, moving companies like to measure their productivity and efficiency fairly closely, and they do it by tons moved per day. And they also look at closely the marginal product of labor. So we've got laid out here a simple measurement chart to achieve those objectives of measuring productivity based upon that particular measurement. So obviously, if you have no workers, you're not going to move anything whatsoever, and your marginal product is zero. Now, stop here for a second. I'm going to make a point about this particular moving company. They started pretty simple, moving people from one apartment to another, let's say, and they specialized in moving boxes and some light furniture. Okay, so they add a worker and they're able to move 2 tons per day. So obviously from their first observation they've increased their marginal product by 2. Here they've added a second worker and they can now move 5 tons per day, a marginal product of 3. And as they add the third worker, we see an increase in total production and also our marginal or incremental production. Now at this point, they seem to be growing and they seem to be successful, and they're being more productive and obviously more efficient. But let's say the company gets an offer to do a job that is significantly different than the jobs they'd been doing in the past and had developed a comfort level with. Let's say instead of just moving boxes and some light furniture, they take an opportunity to move some large number of pianos. And they figure the first thing they need to do for the bigger job, the more complex job, is to add a worker. Now, they wind up moving more weight or more tons per day, but they do it at a little bit of a decreasing rate. Now, this will show why it's really important to keep a close eye on the numbers and the measurements for your business. The Starving Students Moving Company took on larger and more complex jobs, and they were moving more tons per day as they added workers, but they were doing so at a decreasing rate and eventually got into a situation where things plateaued and actual efficiency and productivity wound up decreasing. Where we're going to go next is try to answer the questions as to why this type of thing would happen, where you're adding more workers, but your productivity and efficiency is suffering as a result of that. So let's take a step forward. If you go back to the chart that we just looked at for the moving company, and you look at the numbers in black, up to when they added 3 workers to do the moving of the boxes and the light furniture, we have a measurement concept that we use to describe that type of condition, and it's called increasing marginal returns. This is where output per worker increases so that the second worker actually adds more to the output than the first worker. Now, this happens as a result of taking 2 actions, and we'll talk about those here now. For the moving company to experience increasing marginal returns as a result of adding to its labor force, it first applied what we call division of labor, organizing production of a good into its separate tasks. What they were producing is moving, in the early stages, was moving boxes and light furniture. So what they did is they added workers, had 1 or 2 of the workers be bringing the boxes or furniture out to the truck, and maybe have the second or third worker in the truck taking the boxes and pushing them into and organizing them into the truck for transportation. They may have also specialized, which is focusing the worker's efforts on a particular product or a single task, but with the supporting technology. If in adding to the labor force with additional workers, if they also gave them a dolly or a hand truck that you see here pictured over on the right, it's far easier to transport boxes from a building out to the truck, or if you also had a hand truck on the truck itself, be able to then take the boxes and move them into the truck more efficiently. Division of labor and specialization are the two keys to increasing productivity and efficiency of workers and operations, and can help lead and get a company to economies of scale as well. Okay, I would like for you to now think back to a few moments ago when we were looking at the chart and measuring the productivity of the moving company. And specifically, I would like for you to think back to the point on the chart where I mentioned that the moving company changed the type of jobs that they were handling. I think I referenced that they took on some jobs of moving pianos as an example. But they took on jobs that were larger and more complex. And if you recall, the numbers changed to blue on the chart. And the measurement that we were reflecting here was what we call diminishing marginal returns. It's when you are adding more workers, and it does increase your total output. And if we recall, the total tons moved on the chart clearly displayed an increase in total output. But the output was increased at a decreasing rate. So I have this question for you: what might cause this? And based upon what I've told you about division of labor and specialization, you could probably figure out the three most common reasons as to why diminishing marginal returns would set in with a situation like this. Well, let's think for a second here. They went and took a couple of very big complex jobs moving pianos. Well, it's very probable that their workforce didn't have the skills specifically that were needed to be able to effectively move pianos in a productive and an efficient manner. And also, the moving company probably did not have the right technology, meaning the right tools available that would be needed to move the pianos. And then with little experience in handling those types of large, complex jobs, it's very common that businesses that take these types of things on struggle for a period of time to figure out or to get set down the right methods and procedures and how to handle things. In thinking about our productivity and efficiency measurement chart for the moving company, you may have also recalled that the bottom line on the chart was filled with red numbers, and one of the numbers was actually a negative number. If the moving company does not do something to address the situation where it's experiencing diminishing marginal returns, in other words, find the labor with the right skills, put in place the right methods and procedures, and also support the labor with the right technology and tools, the business will quickly run into this measurement, which we call negative marginal returns, where additional workers actually decrease the output for the firm. So now we've taken a look at some very simple and most common productivity and efficiency measurements for typical businesses that are used quite often. And in our look at measurements for businesses, as well as societies, there's one more thing regarding trade-offs that we need to be aware of that I want to talk about now. The division of labor and specialization certainly help us to figure out how much we should look to trade off in our decision making. However, how much or how far should we go in implementing division of labor and specialization? What I'm going to do now is introduce you to one of the most challenging concepts that you'll be introduced to in our study of economics. It was a concept that was introduced in the late 1700s, early 1800s by the great economist and philosopher David Ricardo. And before I introduce you to the concept here in figuring out how much division of labor and specialization we should use, I'd like to recommend to students, strongly recommend, that they view two videos on the supplemental videos on the class website. One presented by Dr. Holden, who will introduce through his video this concept I'll give you the definition for here in a moment. And also there's a video on return on capital on the website as well, and I highly recommend those. So let me get to David Ricardo's concept here that helps us and guides us into just how far we should go with division of labor and specialization. David Ricardo said that we should look to trade off enough to obtain what he called a comparative advantage. And what he meant is the ability to produce something at a lower marginal opportunity cost than other producers. David Ricardo said that we should always seek to obtain a comparative advantage, even if we have what he called an absolute advantage. An absolute advantage is the ability to produce something using fewer resources than other producers. Now, I have a favorite quote that I use to try to help unlock the depth of meaning behind comparative advantage and absolute advantage. So let me share that quote with you. Here it is. The strong take from the weak, but the wise take from the strong. David Ricardo's concept of comparative advantage is the foundation by which businesses outsource and nations trade. I'll be available in the Course Resource Center to discuss these concepts further to make sure that you all have a thorough understanding of what Ricardo has been talking about. I'm now going to cover one last concept with you with regard to trade-offs and cost measurements in general. And that concept is the law of increasing costs. I'm going to give you the definition of law and then give you an example to illustrate the point. So here's your definition. The law of increasing costs says that the more we trade off or specialize, we will eventually realize fewer benefits. Now here's the example to illustrate the point. I'm going to take professional bodybuilders. And hey, you may recognize one of the people in this picture. It's the former governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, during his days as Mr. Universe. You may know that bodybuilders spend an awful lot of time in the gym working on total body development. As a matter of fact, they spend a large portion of their waking hours as they're developing themselves for competition to look like this. It takes a lot of hard work and time. But believe it or not, once they have reached their full potential development based upon their body structure and metabolism, they actually back off the amount of time that they spend in the gym on their weight training. And the reason they do this is so that they can avoid injury. Because once they have reached their maximum potential, to continue to work or strain or develop the muscle further, the risk of injury goes up. So they trade off and back off and use certain days to work on certain types of toning and to keep things developed rather than push the development further. They clearly understand the law of increasing costs. Now, businesses need to be aware of this, but societies need to be aware of it too. And if they really don't understand the law of increasing costs, they can make mistakes. We have examples of this occurring throughout history. The latest or more recent one in history was what happened in the Soviet Union. The measurements we have looked at with regard to productivity and efficiency work for societies as well. They're really no different, societies that is, than individuals and businesses. And the reason for that is a society is a reflection of its people and its businesses and goes through very similar or the same decision-making processes regarding costs. So who then makes the decisions for a society? Individually, it's you. Businesses, it's the owner or manager of the business. But who makes the decisions for the society? Well, it's really the government officials that we elect. And our government officials put our government's economic decisions into action generally 4 ways. First, through tax increases or tax cuts. Second, through spending or not spending on specific programs. Third, on regulating or deregulating businesses and industries. And fourth, through the provision of subsidies. Now, these are just being touched on here for a moment. We're going to look at various aspects of these economic decisions and what's put into action throughout our entire year. In wrapping up part 2 of chapter 2, and chapter 2 in total, it's time to take a look at goals for decision making and how they relate to a cost-benefit analysis. So here are the fundamental goals for decision making and how they relate to the 3 focal points of a cost-benefit analysis. With regard to all decisions, an eye should be put towards efficiency, meaning are you using resources in such a way as to maximize the benefits from the output of your goods and services or yourself. A second goal for decision making is to try to ensure that growth is occurring. And what we mean by growth is, are more land, labor, or capital resources, the factors of production, becoming available as a result of the decision. And our third goal for decision making and focal point in the cost-benefit analysis is the topic of cost. In any decision you make sure that the value of the alternative that you're giving up when you choose one option over the other is really worth it. Now this brings us to the end of chapter 2. I want to once again recommend that students not forget the supplemental videos. They help you really understand some of the concepts that we've covered throughout this chapter. And we'll be seeing you in chapter 3 coming up next.